to thank everybody for being here today. I'm Tony Zamet. I'm the Communications Director for the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research at Michigan State. Honored today to be joined by our two distinguished guests. I was telling them, I think, between the two of them, they may be some of the most accomplished public servants of our generation here in the state. First, we'll have Rachael Eubanks, the State Treasurer, speak. Rachael was appointed as Michigan's 47th State Treasurer by Governor Whitmer in January of 2019. She is committed to bringing creativity, collaboration, and commitment to identify and implement solutions to some of Michigan's greatest challenges. In 2016, she was appointed by Governor Rick Snyder to serve on Michigan's Public Service Commission as a utility regulatory commissioner. In that capacity, she reviewed and voted on hundreds of orders that helped shape Michigan's energy future. Prior to that role, Treasurer Eubanks structured more than $25 billion in bond finances for public entities, primarily the state of Michigan, the State Building Authority, Michigan Finance Authority, and the Michigan Strategic Fund. She obtained her bachelor's in economics from the University of Michigan. We won't hold that against her.
Thank you. Thank you.
We also have Jen Flood, the State Budget Director. Jen is responsible for coordinating all aspects of the state budget and oversees CEPI, OFM, OIAS, and SIGMA. Prior to serving in the State Budget Office, Director Flood served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Governor Whitmer, where she managed key divisions of the State Executive Office, including policy, legislative affairs, federal affairs, appointments, community engagement, and scheduling. She also worked as a government policy advisor at Dykema, a communications specialist at Byram Frisk Advocacy Communications, and spent time in the Michigan House and Senate and Executive Office of Governor Jennifer Granholm. Flood holds a bachelor's degree in economics and master's of public policy from Michigan State University, Go Green, and is also a graduate of the Michigan Political Leadership Program. Treasurer Eubanks, take it away.
All right. Thank you for the introduction. I always feel like when someone, gives my educational background, I have to provide a qualifier, which is I'm from East Lansing. I went to East Lansing High School, go Trojans, state champions in basketball, and grew up as a Michigan State fan. So I still like Michigan State except for that certain Saturday in the fall when I go for my alma mater. But really appreciate this time getting to spend with all of you and talking through, some just basic knowledge about this Department of Treasury, also how we go about bringing together the revenue picture of the state of Michigan that then Director Flood will touch on, how we sort of divide up that pie once the size of that pie is set. So we're going to go through these slides. We have a few slides, but I think we're going to go through them relatively quickly. Really the goal here is to provide ample time for questions and answers, so please think of your questions, and we're happy to engage in a healthy dialogue once we get through our set presentations here. So just a reminder of what Treasury does. So the Department of Treasury in Michigan is one of the largest and most diversified in terms of financial functions treasuries across the country, because all of the financial functions in the state, aside from some of the appropriations work and budget work that Director Flood does, is pretty much consolidated in one department. So this allows for a lot of efficiencies that we gain in having all the services under one roof. So of course, everyone knows about the taxes part. It is March, it's almost April. So we do administer more than $30 billion in taxes and fees every year. That's about 9.7 million tax returns. We are the lead in this state and local tax policy and economic growth and forecasting. That's going to be the bulk of my slides today. We manage the state's investment funds for the pension system, the state of Michigan retirement system. That includes public school teachers, other retired employees like state employees, police officers, etc. It's about a $165 billion portfolio that's managed under the Department of Bureau of Investments. We have jurisdiction over local government and school district financial health. We manage the relationships with Wall Street, the rating agencies. We are lead on the bond issuance process. We help Michiganders realize their post-secondary attainment dreams through 529 plans. You may know them as MET and MESP, which are tax advantage college savings programs. And we also serve as the state's lost and found box. Last year, we returned another record of $138 million back to Michiganders. So if you want an excuse to be on your phone, here it is. Please go to michigan.gov/unclaimed property. Look to see if you've got anything to claim. You'll be surprised. Every time I go to a group, someone has something. So I'm going to circle back at the end of my remarks and see if you found something. I bet you'll be somebody. Maybe you won't want to stay because it's so big. But anyway, yeah, so we are right in the middle of tax season, tax filing season. It opened on January 27th, and we process tax returns, expediently when we receive them. One thing I would note for all of you, if you have yet to file your taxes, please consider e-filing. The state is already up to about 91% of e-file. It helps the process. There's less errors. We can turn the refunds around more quickly. And so it just makes a faster process in about 4 weeks or less is an average what we're returning refunds on compared to a paper return, which we're very happy to have also, but that takes a little bit longer, about 8 weeks. So, and please consider direct deposit and as you're working through all of your tax items. So we're right in the middle with really robust tax filing season. Two major changes that occurred last year, which we're continuing through this year, is of course the quintupling of the Earned Income Tax Credit, also known as the Working Families Tax Credit. So that changed it from 6% of the federal amount to 30%. So this means big, maybe we have some EITC fans in the audience, absolutely. For the 2023 tax year, about 653,000 recipients got an average refund about $836. So this is real money back in people's pockets and part of the targeted tax relief package. Another piece of that was the retirement tax repeal. This is, sort of restoring the ability for retirement income not to be taxed. It actually is a little bit different than it was previously in that it holds everyone harmless. So retirees, depending on their situation, can choose the right method to file for them that results in the most savings. And this is being phased in over a 4-year period of time. So as those cohorts are going through, if you're in that bracket of folks who are in the retirement years of your life, or somebody who is, I encourage you to work with a tax advisor to figure out, if this applies to you or not. It's a little bit of a complicated formula given the way that original law was written and then the phasing combined part of it. So again, this is, you can file here through My Fast File. There's resources there to file for free if possible. We are working on a systems upgrade to hopefully provide expanded free filing services in upcoming tax years. All right, so moving on to what's happening with the economy. So how do we forecast the revenue picture that begins as the starting point of the state's budget process? So just a reminder, there is a consensus revenue estimating process. It's a statutorily recognized best practice across the country, where twice a year, in January and May, myself, Director Flood, and the directors of the House and Senate fiscal agencies all convene to go through what we believe the economic projections are for the remainder of that current fiscal year, as well as the subsequent 2 fiscal years. And to do that, we usually start with an overview of what's happening with the economy, get on the same page about that, because that's going to be the strongest indicator of how state revenue will perform once we decide on an economic forecast. So from a U.S. perspective, think about, we're a microcosm of our economy as part of the national economy. So when we first step back and think about what's going on the U.S. level. So we know that job growth has continued since the brief, what we call sharp and short, I like to call it square root shaped recovery that was the pandemic, which took about 23 months for us to gain back all of the jobs that we lost, compared to the Great Recession, right, which took about 78 months. So this was a much faster turnaround. And on top of that, we've seen a tremendous amount of job growth after that, short period of job loss. And this is shown in the numbers. We right away in the beginning, so sort of you think about the shape of a square root, right? It's a really sharp V and then sort of like a long taper off. And that matches here with our monthly payroll employment numbers increasing. Each of those bars are how many jobs we added each month, the really robust start right after the downturn. But still, job creation is on a positive trajectory going forward. When you look at it from month to month, this is one of the economic indicators that gets a lot of attention, but certainly still nice, strong job gains across the U.S. We know that when it comes to the Federal Reserve, they've made it very clear that in guiding monetary policy for the country, that enemy number one is and continues to be inflation. So we watch this very closely as well to think through how that may impact monetary policy, which of course impacts many loads on consumer goods, houses, and that can impact discretionary income here in Michigan. So the blue line here is the overall CPI, which is the full basket of goods, and then the green line is the core portion, which excludes the very volatile commodities of food and energy. So, depending on the period of time, we've seen one of those higher than the other. Generally, they're sort of settling in around the low 3% range right now. We know that's still higher than the Federal Reserve has indicated they would like, more in the 2% range. So they came back, at their last meeting, was it last week or 2 weeks ago now, where they said, they held rate steady, but indicated, that 2 rate cuts were to be expected this year, which sort of seems in line with what they've expressed, what they're looking for in terms of inflation expectations. Now, inflation is not hitting the entirety of the economy equally. The blue line here is our services component of the economy, and the green line here is the goods economy, the goods portion. And after this incredible run-up in prices that we saw, the 30, 40-year highs in 2022, that amount of inflation in the goods sector has really retreated, even into deflationary territory for a good period of time, about the last year or so. I think there's some reflection of supply chains equalizing and making sure inventories are at the right level depending on consumer demands after a very period of robust demand on our production supply chain. Services are still the area that remains sort of high. We know that this is an area that the Fed is looking at. There's a lot of wages and housing costs in here, which are keeping that number a little bit inflated, but it's still trending down in the right direction, and of course, goods being still declining in prices. So how does it all translate into Michigan? So this is the same type of data in terms of overall employment in Michigan at the state level versus what we just saw at the national level. Of course, it took us longer to recover from the Great Recession than the U.S. on average, but we did recover relatively quickly from the pandemic as well, and we have reached and exceeded our pre-pandemic job level. So that continues to grow, which is great news for our employment picture here in Michigan. And you can't really talk about jobs in Michigan without talking about the auto industry. And they have gone through, a really challenging several years as they face their own supply chains, being short on microchips and, surprising things that you wouldn't think we'd be short on, like seat cushion foam, and a bunch of goods there that challenged them to sort of rethink their production levels. And they shifted back from, sort of a balance, and this has been a consumer trend which is going on for a while, but you see this really exacerbated in the pandemic, which was, this preference for the light truck category, which is the dark blue line on the graph on the left. So the dark blue line would indicate anything you think of as a light truck, a pickup truck, an SUV, a crossover vehicle, anything like that, versus a really traditional sedan, which is in the light blue line. And this is the Michigan, specifically, motor vehicle production. So, the automakers shifted, they took their limited resources, they sort of shifted to these higher margin vehicles, which are the light truck category, and away from some of the lower margin vehicles, which is the car category. And the graph on the right shows how that's impacted, the profitability as we can measure through the UAW profit sharing metrics. Ford and GM have seen sort of record profitability still in the last several years compared to this graph here. The bars here go all the way back to 2019, so you can see the trajectory of that profit sharing payment per employee. Compared to Stellantis, we have here on the right, which did see a dip as compared to the last couple of years. Obviously, Stellantis has been somewhat transparent in some of their issues, but I think still really good to see the auto industry having high levels of profitability. So when we think about our largest employment sectors and what this means for Michigan, I thought I would just give a little context for what our current economic environment is for job sectors compared to what it was going back several decades. So going back to 1990, which is the top light blue bar here, you can see manufacturing used to be by far the largest component of our economy at about 21%, which is greater than 1 in 5 employees in the state worked in the auto sector. Over the next several decades, and going to the most recent read, which is the purple line from 2024, you saw a contraction in that sector, primarily around the Great Recession and a lot of the restructuring automakers did then. And now we're about at 13.5% of the economy. And that's not saying that manufacturing is not incredibly important in Michigan. Of course it is. But when we think about how any impacts of the auto industry can impact the state as a whole, it's got a much lesser magnitude if they're facing headwinds than we see sort of picking up in the state overall. So it's a much less large of a magnitude that we expect as economists compared to what it was in the 90s. Our biggest industry now, and it's sort of been hanging in there for several decades, is trades, transportation, and utilities. A lot of that, warehousing and other components that are involved in that sector of the economy. So still, a very large piece of the economy, and much greater than what we're seeing now in manufacturing. So how does it all translate into the revenue picture? So we've got the 4 major tax types that we forecast as part of the revenue conference here. The dark blue lines are actual performance per fiscal year, and the green bars are our forecast that we agreed upon at the most recent January revenue conference. And that sales and use tax collections on the upper left-hand side is one I probably get the most questions about, which is, how are you thinking about consumer behavior changing after the extraordinary experience we saw during the pandemic, right? So you see, look at, for example, fiscal year 21 compared to fiscal year 20, fiscal year 22 to 21. I mean, you see these large increases in sales tax month after month. But then we sort of forecasted a leveling out. And I really have to give credit to our economists that we work with to get that forecast right, because I think they pinpointed the exact turnaround of when we were going to see sort of a new normal and a flattening out of what sales tax produces. Because again, remember, sales tax is a percentage, right? So it's not just how much you're buying, but how much it costs you're buying. So when you take all of those pieces together, we generally have a flat sales tax forecast looking out for the next several fiscal years. Individual income tax has been really strong. We're forecasting solid growth through that period of time. Our state education property tax, so this is the 6 mills in the local level that goes into the schooling fund, that's continued projected to grow. And then the lower right is the corporate income tax collections, which the corporate income tax is a relatively new tax by state of Michigan standards. It replaced the Michigan business tax, and since then it's been somewhat difficult to forecast. As you can see, there's some volatility to that tax. But sort of extraordinarily, I mean, from 2020, it was 1.1 billion to this past year, it was 2.2 billion. So it roughly doubled in about 4 years. But the forecast does not assume that that will continue to grow at that pace, but that we'll see a leveling out in the corporate income tax as well. And all of these, revenue forecasts reflect what we've seen in terms of targeted tax policy changes over the last several years. We had an individual income tax rate trigger that factored into our fiscal years 23 and 24 that was related to a temporary reduction or 1-year reduction for tax year 23. We had the corporate income tax earmarks that went for economic development and placemaking, housing, and other items, which are scheduled to sunset in fiscal year 26. The earned income tax credit, which you talked about a little bit, that was coming online and going through the forecast horizon. You can see the phase in here for the retirement tax, and we also had some changes in delivery and installation exemptions. So altogether, it's about going through the fiscal year 25 and sort of setting aside 26 because of the sunset and the SOAR. It's about $1.5 billion every year of targeted tax relief that Michiganders are enjoying. So again, going back to some of those earlier slides, that you can see the impacts, the real impacts in getting these dollars into people's pockets on an annual basis and the difference that can make. So I always like to end on, what is sort of the picture. It's hard to, when you talk about numbers this big, it's kind of hard to think about, the perspective of everything. So our big 2 taxes are income tax and sales and use taxes. I mean, that's really, 2/3 of our revenue base in Michigan. So when you think about, a lot of the other taxes that get brought up a lot, this of course is fiscal year 23, so this is why you see, sort of corporate taxes being a little bit lower. But, when it's related to that or, marijuana taxes or anything like that, which ends up sort of in that other category because they're lesser amounts compared to our really big 2 taxes. So when we're forecasting our revenues going forward, we spend an awful lot of time looking at economic factors that impact those 2 major tax types being the primary part of it. I would just point out in terms of road funding, currently that is compiled of the gasoline tax, which is about $1.5 billion, about equivalent in motor vehicle registrations as well. So that equals about $3 billion going into the transportation fund every year. So that wraps up my portion on the economic and revenue forecast. And I'll turn over to Director Flood to walk through the budget.
good afternoon. Thanks for hosting. It's nice to be back on the 5th floor of the Hob. I worked a couple of doors down, so thanks to those who work here for joining during spring break. I know it's a quieter time. Wanted to spend a couple minutes running through a speed round of the governor's budget that she presented in February, and then make sure we save time for questions. Also, Tony mentioned a lot of acronyms that are involved in the budget office that I won't drag all of you through, but in addition to the work that we do to develop, negotiate, and implement the budget, we also have wonderful teams of auditors, accountants, Sigma, which is like the backbone of the state's financial transactions, and so we're always looking for great people to join our team in case anyone is interested. The treasurer touched a little bit on our budget development cycle. We're sort of at like 3 to 4 o'clock here in the graph, and so the governor put out her budget in February. We're in the midst of legislative action in both the House and the Senate right now. In May, our economists will all get together again to update their forecasts and sort of tell us how many dollars there are to work with, and then we'll spend the next weeks or months finalizing any differences between the House, the Senate, and the governor's proposal. Over the past number of years, we've gotten our budget done in June. There's a statutory requirement to do that, and it aligns us with local governments and school districts across the state, so they know the resources that they're working with, higher education institutions as well. So we are optimistic and hopeful that we can get the budget done in June. The House seems to be working on a different timeline with completion in September, but I know we'll get something done. We've done bipartisan balanced budgets on time for 6 years under Governor Whitmer. I know we'll have a 7th this year as well. Just a big picture look at our state budget. The fiscal year 26 budget, the governor announces $83.5 billion. Of that, 42% comes from the federal government. I'll touch on that in just a minute. The school aid budget is about a quarter, and the general fund is about 18%. That's the area of the budget that gets the most focus, and we'll talk more about today. But I did want to dive a little deeper on federal funding. There's a lot of discussion at the federal level about pauses and grants. We, like many others, were closely tracking a potential shutdown, which I'm glad we avoided again, but also major tax changes that are being considered through the reconciliation process. We've seen budgets move that would cut about $900 billion in Medicaid, which would have really serious impacts on our state. And so other federal funding that comes into the state, making sure our water is safe to drink, food is safe to eat, child care, Head Start, Meals on Wheels, emergency response, as well as roads and infrastructure. So I mentioned 42% of our budget is federal funds. We, at different points in time over the past few months, whether it was grants being paused or programs up for cuts, we've been asked, like, well, you guys can backfill it, right? And so I've been trying to just level set. We've done a great job managing the state's finances. We've got nearly $3 billion set aside in our rainy day fund, but there's just no way that we could fill some of the holes that have been discussed. So just wanted to sort of share that perspective. So this is dialing in on the general fund. This is where Lansing focuses the most attention. We've got about $15 billion that is discretionary, where we work with the legislature. About half of that goes to Health and Human Services. On the whole, 80% of it is healthcare, protection of vulnerable children and adults, higher education, and public safety, and all the other departments in their programming is about 20%. Here's a snapshot of the general fund over the time the governor's been in office. When you adjust for inflation, it's grown about 11%. We had some incredible opportunities during the pandemic with big surges in one-time federal funds to help keep people safe, but we also made some incredible investments in infrastructure, state parks, clean drinking water. We built a new state psychiatric hospital, which will open up next year, and I'll talk about a little bit later. I did also want to highlight our work on fiscal responsibility. This is obviously something that we do jointly with the legislature. Over the governor's time, we will have paid down more than $25 billion in debt. We've seen upgrades to the state's credit rating. We built up, this budget proposes an additional $50 million deposit into the rainy day fund and $50 million into our state's new school rainy day fund. With those two deposits, you can sort of see the trend over time. The total balance in both of those accounts will be about $3 billion. So we'll be well positioned compared to what some other states are looking at. I'm actually leaving tomorrow for a conference with state budget directors from around the country. It's a great time if anyone's looking for something to do in Atlanta, so there will be some basketball games there too. But my colleagues in other states are dealing with a really different picture, and we don't always talk about that here every day. So whether it's deficits or looking at tax increases just to maintain current spending, I like to share this just in that we've got a relatively good position that we are starting from here. In Michigan, we continue to see surpluses. We'll track closely what happens with the economy, but we are in relatively good shape here to make some good investments in fiscal year 26. I mentioned the debt that we've paid down. We have this amazing team who works at Treasury managing the state's retirement assets, and they beat their peers every single year. This is all behind the scenes, but because of their overperformance, we've got an extra $2 billion in this year's budget alone, so I'd like to highlight their work. And on to the 26 executive budget recommendation. This budget continues to focus on the issues that matter most to Michiganders. So you've heard the governor talk about all of these before. Lowering costs, creating jobs, supporting seniors. We've got some new exciting investments in education, protecting and defending Michiganders, and making government work better. On lowering costs, the treasurer talked a little bit about inflation, and while state government alone can't solve inflation, we've been looking at what can we do to make a difference for people. Our biggest progress here has been in education, so we expanded high quality pre-K for free to every 4-year-old in the state. That saves families about $10,000. We've got free school meals and really new exciting scholarship programs that cover the cost of a certificate, associate's degree, and up to $27,000 towards a 4-year degree. We also have in this budget a new water affordability program and continuation of the Working Families Tax Credit, which the treasurer mentioned. On making healthcare more accessible, we're proposing expanding Medicaid access. So right now, seniors and Michiganders with disabilities have to spend down into deep poverty in order to access healthcare, and so we're proposing an increase in the eligibility threshold. We're continuing to roll out the opioid settlement dollars across the state, partnering with local governments and investing in first responders as well. On creating jobs, we've got support for small businesses in this budget. My parents are small business owners, and they work harder than anyone I know, and so we all know that small businesses are the lifeblood of our communities, and so we've got continued resources for small businesses, entrepreneurs in downtowns. We're streamlining environmental permitting. This is one of my favorite things in the budget to talk about. It's very nerdy. Right now, EGLE, the Department of Energy, Great Lakes and Environment, has environmental records, 4 billion of them that are paper, and they're spread out across 3 different buildings downtown. And so when someone is going to do research on a property in their community, or a business is looking to expand and develop property infrastructure projects, someone has to go through and dig up paper records. And the agency's been making a lot of progress over time. There was state employees working remotely with scanners trying to digitize these records, and we're saying let's surge resources so that we can make the records more transparent, accessible online, make sure we can get shovels in the ground faster. On skilled talent, we're continuing the Going Pro program, which provides grants to businesses to train their employees, expanding apprenticeships, and making a record investment in CTE to show students a path towards a different career, as well as removing barriers to work. On education, we have a really exciting proposal bringing the foundational allowance to $10,000 per pupil for the first time in the state's history. We're doubling down on literacy coaches, including free school meals. We've got ongoing investments in student mental health, which is a problem across the state. But we're also pairing that with what we're calling the SMART plan, students, metrics, and results with transparency. We've seen across the country that test scores are not where they need to be. And unfortunately, Michigan's been a part of that trend. And so we're pairing this record investment with extra support to schools to help embrace evidence-based curriculum and offer a menu of options that are tested and proven here in the state to improve student outcomes. On protecting kids and seniors, this budget, like the treasurer mentioned, includes the full phase-in of the retirement tax rollback. We got extra resources for oversight in nursing homes and our state's licensed retirement communities, support for dementia, and an expansion of PACE sites, which allows seniors to age in place rather than move into nursing homes. And on keeping kids safe, we have additional investments in our foster care system. We've made some really good progress here, and there's more work to do. So there's investments to keep kids connected with their family, improve permanency and adoption support, and then also support young adults as they transition out of the foster care system. We're continuing to invest in leveling the playing field, so investing in juvenile justice, expanding eligibility for the My Able program, which the treasurer runs. It allows Michiganders with disabilities to save without impacting their eligibility for assistance, and also reducing recidivism. On infrastructure and the environment, the budget includes $80 million for water infrastructure. That's to help communities across the state. We've got $112 million to draw down every federal dollar for roads, which I'll come back to in just a minute. Continuing to install EV chargers across the state, investing in our state parks, bringing Michigan's tipping fee in line with our other Midwest states, because right now we have a lot of trash coming into Michigan. We'd like to slow that down. And then we've also got an investment in removing dams and restoring our waterways. On the roads, we've made some progress. So you can see the white part of this graph here. Since the governor took office, we've invested $28 billion in the roads. That's through partnering with the legislature, but largely the governor's bonding program and also a one-time federal dollars. But without new funding, you can see that teal line will trail off over time. So we are still in need of a comprehensive road funding plan. The governor announced the My Road Ahead plan a couple weeks ago, making sure that all the taxes paid at the pump are directed to roads while holding schools harmless, increasing the amount that big tech and wealthy corporations contribute to allocate another $1.6 billion for roads and infrastructure. On this, I think about the way that we use our roads, especially post-pandemic. My household, I know we've got Shipt, DoorDash, Amazon, FedEx, and UPS pulling down our neighborhood street at least 3 or 4 times a week. And so thinking about how the roads get used and how we are funding improvements going forward. We're proposing closing the loophole that exempts marijuana from the wholesale tax that tobacco pays. The plan generates $3 billion in roads, and $1 billion of that goes to local roads. So a lot of the progress we've made has been on our state's highways, as I'm sure folks have noticed with orange barrels over the past few years. So how do we redirect some of those resources into neighborhood roads in the communities, as well as invest in transit? On protecting and defending Michiganders, the budget includes a 4% increase in revenue sharing, which largely supports police and fire in communities across the state. It's got $75 million for the Public Safety Trust Fund, continuing to support victim support services. This is something that the federal government had previously funded, but that support is declining, so we want to make sure we have the support here. We've got upgraded infrastructure at Selfridge to continue to build our defense industry, as well as supporting mental health for first responders. And then here's some more nerdy stuff that I'd like to highlight. We made a lot of improvements in IT and our state-owned buildings, but continuing to invest there so that we're doing ongoing maintenance is the responsible thing to do with taxpayer dollars. I mentioned we'll be ready to move into the new state psych hospital this year, and so we've got resources to make that transition. And with that, we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much to our guests. We do have a microphone that'll be going around. I think we have a question on this side, but I'll start us off. Treasurer Eubanks, with some of the fears right now about inflation, do we see any reduction in terms of spending that might affect sales tax revenue?
So It's interesting because, I mean, the sales tax, as I sort of touched on, it's a combination of the price and the quantity of goods sold, because it's just a 6% tax. So, I mean, inflation sort of had the unintended consequence of, even if people pulled back on their spending, if they were buying less but everything cost more, it would sort of stay at a level amount. So, I mean, so far, I think our forecast, I mentioned it, we sort of flattened it out last year, and we sort of stayed at a relatively same level. I still think, that's an appropriate forecast given what we know about inflation. But of course, as we look forward to, what happens in May, we'll be updating that again.
Excellent. Director Flood, in terms of there's obviously been back and forth between us and Washington with some of the president's priorities. Is there a certain key area that we're worried about in terms of budget?
Yeah, I think that Medicaid is our top, I'll say Medicaid and education are our top concerns. Between Medicaid and our Healthy Michigan Medicaid expansion, which was passed under Governor Snyder and an all-Republican legislature, there are more than 2.8 million Michiganders who access health care either through Medicaid or Healthy Michigan. In large part, that's seniors, people with disabilities, children, and pregnant women. And so when you talk about cuts of the size that are being discussed in Washington, D.C., there could be real impacts on Michiganders and depending on, so we're sort of using this time right now to talk about what those impacts could be and what they mean, and reaching out to educate our congressional delegation. We'll partner with anyone in this room if you're interested in doing that. To try to lessen the impact of what comes our way, but depending on what cuts come through, we're going to have some really difficult conversations and decisions to make here in the state. Beyond that, education is a top concern too. We're taking a look at the executive order that was signed by President Trump to dismantle the Department of Education last week. I think there's a lot of questions still to be answered on if programs are being transferred to other departments, what that looks like. Congress obviously has a role to play, but about 10% of our education funding comes from the federal government. That's largely funds for students that are living in poverty. In the state, we've made a ton of progress on what we call the weighted foundational allowance, which means we send more resources to the kids who need the most support, and that's been a bipartisan effort. So we're watching closely those dollars as well as students in special education and with disabilities. So it will remain to be seen what comes to fruition, but there will be real impacts of the state.
Thank you. If you could announce your name when you're called upon, as well as either your office or your city if you're a guest.
Hi, my name is Andy Brancato, and I'm with the Office of the Clerk. I have a question just about how difficult is it to forecast when we see one day we're having tariffs, the next day we're not, the next day some people get the tariff, or some countries get the tariff, some don't. I mean, there's been a lot of volatility as far as what's going to happen with that, or when things like something like a tariff, which can be fairly significant, I would assume. How difficult is it to forecast that and to work that into the planning of a budget or the planning of resources?
Yes. So thank you for the question. I think when we pull together the economic revenue forecast for the consensus revenue conference, we go through, the list of risks to the forecast. They can be upside risks, they can be downside risks. This was one of the big areas that we talked about as being, risks to the forecast starting in January. But critically important here is the details of this matter. What are the amounts of the tariffs? What are they assessed on? How much of that does that impact Michigan industry directly? What are the timing of those tariffs? All those type of things. I think the latest development as of yesterday made just 2 points on the tariffs that I think the stock market reacted favorably to, and hopefully will have a buoying effect to the rest of the economy, which was, the state sort of, the president sort of backed off of some of the other retaliatory tariffs that he was looking at, and the stock market saw like nearly a 2% rally yesterday because of that. The second piece is there was this this conversation around the April 2nd date and what is that going to mean for the auto industry. And, that is something that doesn't appear that it's going to take effect on, the semiconductor and the auto industries as of the latest yesterday. We're of course watching it closely. We have to be nimble and adaptable and forecasting the revenues. But, we try to, remind folks, we have a very complicated supply chain, especially related to the auto industry in Michigan. Parts can cross the border numerous times, up to 6 times, depending on, what is the part that automaker is using. And so understanding the details around how that would be calculated based on that, movement of that part, can make a big difference. So I think for now, it's something that we still think is, something we're watching closely on the forecast. We're hopeful that, given that the April 2nd date seems to be less significant now, that there'll, be some thoughtfulness around that and just understanding of what that means for each of these parts as they're going through those 6 steps of the supply chain.
Hi, Chelsea Dowler with the Lansing Economic Development Corporation. I realize we were here to talk state budget, but there were lots of things about local, finances in there with revenue sharing, especially with local roads. The city of Lansing, I think, could take up about a quarter of those, that $1 billion for local road funding. So I'm just curious if whether it's in the state budget office or the Department of Treasury or elsewhere in state government, is there anyone that's evaluating the fiscal health of your local governments? Because there's a lot of focus. I'm so happy to see the state has money and its rainy day fund and all of that, but I think on the ground with your local governments, it's not so sunny.
So the responsibility for local government, school district financial health falls in Treasury. Now on the school district side, there is a package of legislation that's about 10 years old now that provides an early warning system for school district financial health. And it looks at things like fund balance levels and people count declines and a number of other metrics that sort of provide a very prescriptive way for a district to go through, like a probable financial stress, an early warning indicator, like a true financial stress process. And part of that is trying to get ahead of these little issues before they become full-blown emergencies. And often what we find is when we pick up a school district on the probable financial stress area, really all it is more reporting and more conversations with our staff. And there is a real need for finance professionals to serve in their communities, because we see a lot of times these districts have, CFO leaves, and it's very, very hard to fill that position. And so then they can miss things like grant applications. And so like working with us, we can provide them technical assistance or just advice, or hey, are you getting XYZ documentation done so that you can get the amount of dollars to come to you, has been a critical part of that success. Even though the same thing isn't as prescriptive on the local government side, we still try to work with our local governments under a trusted partner model to be the first call when they run into financial distress versus, the last call when they're heading, full blown into a big emergency. I think so far that's been successful in warding things off, but if you're saying, looking at like revenue declines or, the things that locals are facing, those issues on the local level, we have not seen areas where they're not navigating that in a responsible way so far. Property taxes are usually their main source of revenue. We have 24 cities in Michigan with an income tax as well. All of those, generally across the board are performing positively after a period of time of decline, especially with the property tax because of how Headley works. We're not seeing any sort of mass financial issues across the board. And that's not saying that every now and then a community won't run into some trouble, but we're here to help, and that's our first goal.
Next question, in the back.
Hi, excuse me, Sarah Kyle. I am the mayor of the city of Gladman. I sat in a legislative breakfast last week in obviously mid-Michigan, and they were absolutely convinced we are not going to have a budget by September 30th. And you're very convinced that we are. Can you help me gauge where we should be as a real, and you could be legit later, but I feel like, what is this real, can you be legit honest, like where should we be?
Is that a bad question? No, it's a great question. So there's 2 deadlines when it comes to our state's budget. The first is June 30th. That's set in statute, and it says the legislature should present a budget to the governor by June 30th. There's a September 30th constitutional deadline. So that is the harder deadline. If we don't have a budget by September 30th, state government has to shut down. That hasn't happened in a long time, and so I'm very hopeful that we can work together to get it done. I know we're in a phase of divided government, but we've been here before, and so the governor's first, I can't speak to previous administrations, but Governor Whitmer's first 4 years, we had an all-Republican legislature, and we got 4 balanced budgets done on time. And so I know that we can do it again. There is, some noise around, is it June, is it September? It says in the law that the legislature should pass a budget by June. I don't work in that branch of government. Others here do if they want to weigh in. I know that we could get it done by then. And I'm hopeful and confident. I think we all care about the same things. I'll say that. We care about making our state a better place. We care about making sure that our schools are funded, kids are learning, we're fixing the roads, people have access to healthcare, and so we might have some differences in opinion on how we get there, but I know that we can get it done.
We have time for a few more. George?
Yeah.
He's good with the microphone for us.
George Maskelson, Hazlet, Michigan. How much money goes from Michigan to the federal government, and how much money does Michigan get back from the federal government? And when the money comes back from the federal government, it comes back according to federal priorities and probably federal strings attached. Why is that model better than the money that's generated in Michigan stay in Michigan and be spent according to Michigan priorities, than Michigan money being spent according to federal priorities? Thanks.
Thank you.
So I had a slide in about the amount of taxes paid at the federal, state, and local levels that I actually took out in the interest of time. So I'm happy to share that if it's helpful to get your numbers. I don't have that number off the top of my head, but and Director Flight, I don't know if you can answer the second part of the question.
Yeah, Michigan is a donor state, so residents and businesses of Michigan, we send more to Washington, D.C. than we bring home. So if there was a mass wholesale change, we would take the dollars here and invest them wisely. Surely, the facts on the different streams and how that works, they all have different formulas. I can say Medicaid is on my mind every day right now. Michigan is one of the states that actually draws down more federally than a lot of others. There's just one example of how the distribution is determined. The federal match rate depends on where your state ranks in terms of national income. And so we have a higher federal drawdown than a lot of other states. But we're always looking at ways to think creatively, and sometimes the system needs to be broken in order to do it better. But I hope they don't break it all of the way, and we'll continue to draw down everything we can possibly here.
Question up here.
Nathan Bryson in Senator Weber's office. I know a significant portion of the governor's recommendation for road funding comes from an increase in the corporate income tax. And I know a lot of what is coming out of the governor's office is we need to increase what large corporations pay, which I think a lot of people would agree with. But the corporate income tax impacts every corporation in Michigan. Is the governor's office concerned about the economic impact of a pretty significant increase of the corporate income tax on small businesses here in Michigan?
Yeah, when we put together the road funding package, we looked at a number of different options, and I'll say the revenue increases is not necessarily just corporate income tax,
Yeah.
but I mentioned, deliveries could be something that we look closely at. The marijuana industry is something that, voters went to the ballot to approve but didn't work its way through the legislative process, so there's some unique factors in how that industry is taxed. And so when we're looking at options for fixing the roads, we talked about the size of the general fund and where that goes. there's just not a way to cut, to come up with the resources needed to fix the roads. The governor's put out different versions of a road funding plan before. We've sort of, the House has made road funding a priority, and they put a plan on the table with a $3 billion tag on it, and the governor put out a plan that raises $3 billion as well. So I think there's a lot of different ways that we can get there. The more options we have on the table for discussion, the better, but the increase in the corporate income tax is achievable with us still remaining below corporate income tax rates in other Midwest states, which are led by all Republicans. So we felt that the number we put out there would still make sure Michigan's competitive.
Thank you.
Last question. Anyone?
I think that, my name's Natasha Atkinson. I am the Chief of Staff for Rep. Devendorf in the 77th District. And my question, I think, is directed towards Director Flood. If we're accessing the general fund for the roads and everything else, have we taken into account if we lose that 10% from the federal government for education and where that money would come from? And then anticipating, again, as we've mentioned several times, the cuts to Medicaid, are we, do we actually have that money to fill those gaps and put in place the governor's road fund?
The governor's road funding proposal that she rolls out relies on revenues because we know we don't have the resources in the general fund to fix the roads. I had on my slides $100 million in general fund proposed as part of this year's budget. That's what's required to meet the bare minimum to draw down federal resources. But to your point, as we watch what happens out of Washington, D.C., we're going to have some tough decisions to make here in the state, and that's why we've stood by the need for revenue in order to address our infrastructure challenges.
Can I follow up? I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
But with all of that taken into consideration, I mean, again, we're back at, can we make this possible by June? An actual budget when we kind of don't know what's happening federally in those choices. So is there a built-in mechanism that, like, okay, we pass something by June, but something may happen federally and then we have to revisit? So what does that process look like?
Yeah, we will, depending on when our budget gets done and what federal changes come down and when they take effect, it's very likely that we'll have to revisit. One of the things with the other 49 state budget directors, we all work for governors who have very different priorities, but one of the things that we have locked arms on is asking for notice and change. And so to the extent that there are big changes coming, making sure that states have time to plan accordingly. So that's something we'll be working on.
I'd like to thank our guests today for their wonderful information on this topic. Our next forum will be in May, so please watch your emails for that. If you're a state legislative staffer, we will be having a legislative staff training the last week here in April. Again, we'll send some notice out about that. I want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you again.